Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving deep into one of Carl Jung's most profound and, frankly, uncomfortable psychological concepts, the shadow. This construct, well, it encompasses all those disowned, darker aspects of ourselves, things like selfishness, cruelty, even our very capacity for evil that we all carry but often, refuse to acknowledge. Our discussion today stems from recent material, Jung in the Shadow's Embrace, which frames the shadow not just as some abstract idea, but as a really active and influential force, both within individuals and the collective psyche.
Right. And the central question we're grappling with is this. Is direct, conscious confrontation and integration of the shadow the only necessary path to achieve true psychological wholeness and authentic self-awareness? Or perhaps can understanding and managing its influence through more, let's say, indirect means also lead to genuine growth?
Exactly. And I'll be arguing that confronting the shadow head-on is absolutely essential, really the singular pathway to authenticity.
Whereas I'll be suggesting that maybe a more nuanced approach, perhaps less directly confrontational, might also be valid and effective for many people.
Okay, so my position is that the material unequivocally demonstrates that confronting and integrating the shadow isn't just a path, it's the essential path, the only path, really, to true psychological wholeness and authentic self-awareness. Jung himself, as our source material highlights, really challenged a kind of sanitized view of psychology. He showed that every single person harbors selfishness, cruelty, arrogance, manipulation, even the capacity for real evil. And the discomfort we feel with these words, well, it often leads us to project them outwards, doesn't it? What we despise in someone else is so often just a reflection of what we refuse to admit in ourselves. The text makes it abundantly clear that denying these aspects doesn't make them vanish. It just pushes them underground where they operate unconsciously. And this suppression leads to what the material calls shadow-driven decisions in our careers, our relationships, or it traps individuals in what Jung termed a persona prison, this false front we show the world. And inevitably, that pressure builds and it bursts out. Hypocrisy, breakdowns, destructive outbursts, we see it all the time. True growth, real compassion, authentic honesty, Jung argues these are only possible when you acknowledge your own capacity for these darker impulses, the very ones you fear most. We can only be whole, fundamentally, when we stop running from the darkest parts of ourselves.
Okay, while I certainly agree that the material powerfully illustrates the undeniable existence and the pervasive influence of the shadow, and I absolutely acknowledge the dangers of denying it, I come at the necessity part a bit differently. Specifically, the necessity of direct, conscious confrontation as the sole prerequisite for wholeness. The text, it compellingly describes Jung's own journey, his descent into what looked like madness, a harrowing journey, really, to encounter his shadow realm, which he then, interestingly, described as a deeper kind of sanity for him.
Right, for him.
Exactly. But the implications of such a direct, intense confrontation, this idea of looking into the abyss of our unconscious, well, that might not be the universally applicable path. Or maybe even the safest, only pathway for every single individual who's seeking integration. While awareness of the shadow's influence, things like projection or recognizing shadow-driven choices, that's undeniably crucial. I agree there. But the mechanism of integration itself might extend beyond just one kind of direct and potentially destabilizing confrontation. Perhaps understanding and acknowledging these aspects allows for a more managed or maybe indirect integration, where someone becomes acutely aware of the shadow's power, its presence, without necessarily needing to engage in that kind of profound descent that Jung personally experienced. This could still lead to a genuine form of integration, especially if we interpret true integration in a less absolute sense than, say, continuous, direct, maybe overwhelming confrontation with one's full capacity for evil.
Well, that's really where our core disagreement lies, isn't it? You use words like managed or indirect integration. But the material, as I read it, really emphasizes the exclusivity of direct confrontation for getting to genuine wholeness. It states explicitly, and I'm quoting here, "We can only be whole when we stop running from the darkest parts of ourselves." Now, that doesn't sound like one option among many to me. It implies a unique, maybe non-negotiable process. What do you make of that really strong language? Doesn't stop running inherently mean turning around and facing whatever it is we've been avoiding?
Yeah, I see why you emphasize that phrase, and the idea of stopping running is certainly critical. I wouldn't disagree with that. However, the interpretation of how one stops running, that's where the nuance, I think, lies. Does stopping running always have to equate to a singular, direct, maybe overwhelming confrontation with the abyss like Jung himself seemed to experience? Or could it mean something more like a sustained, conscious effort to acknowledge the shadow's mechanisms, its influence in one's life? Think about the persona prison you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
Denying these traits, yes, it leads to that suppression, but someone can become aware of being in a persona prison through, say, deep self-reflection, or understanding their projections onto other people, or recognizing recurring patterns of self-sabotage in their own life. This kind of gradual awakening, this consistent self-observation, that can be a really powerful form of stopping running. And it might not require a dramatic, cataclysmic internal battle. It's more about bringing these parts into conscious awareness and then figuring out how to manage them, which feels different to me than a direct, raw confrontation with some kind of primal darkness.
I'm still not entirely convinced that an indirect approach like that fully satisfies what Jung really meant by integration. Because when the material talks about the alternative to direct confrontation, it points right to that persona prison, right, where these suppressed shadows build immense pressure, and eventually they burst forth. Public scandals, personal breakdowns. And it's not just individual, is it? The text attributes collective shadow possession to phenomena as devastating as Nazi Germany, or, in a more modern context, the sheer intensity of online cancel culture.
Right, the collective aspect is huge.
Exactly. These aren't just cases of lacking abstract understanding. They illustrate the dire consequences when the darker aspects of humanity are not directly engaged with and owned. Jung's teaching on true growth, compassion, honesty, it all seems to hinge on admitting one's capacity for these darker impulses, not just intellectually grasping that they exist somewhere out there or even in here. So how does a less direct approach adequately address the sheer power of these explosive, unintegrated forces?
That's a very compelling point, and those examples of the collective shadow are undeniably powerful. They really illustrate the danger on a grand scale. Nobody disputes that potential for catastrophe. However, I'd argue that the term admitting one's capacity itself might hold a spectrum of engagement. Does admitting our capacity for cruelty, for instance, have to be equivalent to undergoing a profound, maybe destabilizing internal encounter with the full spectrum of cruelty itself? Or could it mean deeply understanding how that capacity manifests in more subtle ways, within our own behavior, our judgments, our biases, and then consciously choosing to act differently because of that understanding? For example, recognizing that our intense dislike for, say, a public figure isn't just about their actions, but it's also a projection of our own unaddressed arrogance or insecurity. That is a form of admitting that capacity, isn't it? It allows for a conscious, deliberate recalibration of our internal landscape and our external behavior. It might be a more continuous process, perhaps, rather than a single, all-encompassing confrontation.
Okay. This leads us nicely to our second point, the actual nature of integration and what authentic goodness really requires. The text clarifies, and I think this is key, that authentic goodness requires acknowledging one's capacity for evil. It's critical to understand this isn't about embracing evil or acting on it. It's about recognizing its potential within, precisely so we can prevent its unconscious manifestation. My worry with an overly managed approach is that it risks staying at the level of, intellectual acknowledgement, rather than profound, transformative integration. Think of the minister in the text, the one who dreamt of violence.
Yes, I remember that example.
He wasn't losing his mind.
His denied shadow was surfacing, demanding attention. Denying selfishness, her anger, drives them underground, where they act unconsciously, often with destructive results. Integration, as Jung seems to present it, is precisely about bringing these disowned parts into conscious awareness to achieve wholeness, not just managing symptoms or gaining abstract insight. It genuinely requires the courage to look into the abyss. So, could you maybe define for me then what integration looks like in your more indirect approach? And how does it avoid becoming just a purely intellectual exercise, keeping that distance?
I appreciate you pressing on that distinction. It's a vital one. And I agree completely. Integration must go beyond purely intellectual acknowledgement. But to suggest that the only way to achieve that deeper, non-intellectual integration is through a singular, direct, and potentially harrowing descent into the abyss for everybody, well, that might be too restrictive. Acknowledging a capacity for evil, in my view, is distinct from actively confronting or integrating the full, raw spectrum of evil itself in a way that risks, psychological destabilization for some. Could acknowledging involve a deep intellectual and emotional understanding of these potentials? Yes. But then translating that into conscious self-regulation, behavioral modification? The material notes that what we despise in others often mirrors the traits buried inside us. That's projection. Becoming aware of these projections, really understanding how our deepest dislikes reflect internal, disowned traits, that is a profound form of integration through insight, I would argue. It's a continuous process of self-reflection and reorientation. It might be more gradual, less cataclysmic than Jung's personal experiences seem to be, yet still deeply transformative. Is true integration about constantly dwelling on the darkness, or is it more about cultivating a conscious awareness that allows us to choose differently, informed by that understanding, without necessarily diving headfirst into the darkest depths every single day?
I hear your point about the potential for ongoing, gradual integration through awareness. But I'm still not convinced that choosing differently, even when informed by understanding, is the same as the deep, transformative work Jung is describing. The examples in the material, the minister's dream, the collective shadow, they seem to point to something that demands more than just conscious choice or intellectual insight. These are powerful, unconscious forces that, when they aren't acknowledged directly, seem to compel us into actions or states we don't even understand. If we don't truly confront the underlying impulse, aren't we just managing the symptoms of an unintegrated shadow rather than integrating the shadow itself? For Jung, this integration isn't just about insight. It seems to be about a fundamental shift in the totality of the personality, a conscious union with these disowned aspects. And that feels like it requires a much more direct encounter than what you're suggesting.
I understand your concern that managed integration might sound superficial, but a profound shift in personality can certainly emerge from consistent, conscious engagement with the shadow's influence, not necessarily just from a single, overwhelming confrontation. Let's take your point about the minister's dream. The dream itself wasn't the integration, was it? It was the signal that the shadow was present, demanding attention. For that minister to integrate it, he would need to explore what that violence symbolized for him, maybe repressed anger, maybe a desire for power he felt was inappropriate for his role. The integration isn't necessarily about reenacting the dream's violence in some way, but about understanding its roots within his own psyche and then making conscious space for those disowned emotions. Perhaps finding healthier outlets, or acknowledging the anger in therapy, for example. That can be a deeply transformative process that fundamentally changes how he interacts with his own aggression, without needing a descent into madness, so to speak. It's about bringing the unconscious into the conscious, allowing for genuine choice rather than just being driven by hidden impulses.
That's an interesting point, and I do concede that awareness of signals, like dreams, is definitely a crucial first step. But let's move to our third area, the practicality and scope of true growth. The material states quite emphatically, true growth is not about affirmations or polishing a persona. It's about confronting the shadow. This seems to directly refute any purely indirect or superficial approaches. It's about genuine self-awareness, which, quote, means acknowledging the very impulses you fear most in yourself. This confrontation is positioned as what enables real compassion, real honesty, real wholeness. I'm still struggling to see how your managed approach truly allows for this level of radical self-acceptance that seems required for true growth. The examples of the collective shadow, like the Rwandan genocide or the amplification of tribalism and judgment in modern online cancel culture, they show such dire consequences of unintegrated, projected darkness on a massive scale. For me, these collective failures really underscore the necessity of direct confrontation, not just individually, but societally. How does a nuanced, less confrontational approach provide the necessary sort of impetus for such profound transformation, whether societal or individual?
That's a critical question, especially regarding the scale of transformation needed. While the material is very clear that superficial approaches are insufficient for true growth, the scope and the method of confronting can, I believe, be varied. Is it possible that for some people, true growth emerges not from a single, direct confrontation with the abyss, but from a sustained, consistent effort? An effort to identify and maybe neutralize the influence of shadow-driven decisions in their lives? Or to consciously choose not to engage in projection, day after day after day? For instance, recognizing that a particular career move isn't motivated by genuine passion, but by a hidden thirst for power or validation. That recognition allows for a conscious decision to reevaluate priorities, maybe align them with deeper values. That is a form of integration and growth, isn't it? Perhaps without the full-scale descent that Jung himself experienced. The phrase, daring to look into the abyss, certainly suggests a specific, potentially intense experience. But the goal of not running from the darkest parts could arguably be achieved through consistent, conscious self-reflection and behavioral modification, all informed by an understanding of the shadow. It's still a profound and ongoing engagement, just maybe not structured as a one-time cataclysmic event for everyone.
But isn't there a risk, though, that by focusing solely on managing influence and behavioral modification, we remain at a somewhat, superficial level? Jung's argument, as I read it, suggests that these darkest parts aren't just influences to be neutralized. They're intrinsic aspects of the self that need to be owned, brought fully into the light of consciousness, and genuinely integrated into the whole personality. It's not just about stopping a bad habit like biting your nails. It's about understanding the primal impulse that drives it. If we don't fully face that impulse, doesn't it just risk morphing into a different, perhaps more insidious form of shadow behavior down the line? True growth, as the material suggests, requires a kind of radical honesty that I believe only direct confrontation can truly facilitate. It's about accepting the capacity for evil within, not just chipping away at its outward manifestations.
I agree completely that it's about accepting the capacity, not just managing the manifestations. My argument is really about how one comes to accept that capacity. For many, a consistent, deep introspective practice, maybe things like journaling, active imagination, or working consistently with a therapist, can guide them to confront these impulses in a way that's less like a sudden, overwhelming descent and maybe more like a carefully navigated expedition into the self. It's not about avoiding the hard work at all, but perhaps about pacing it, making it accessible and sustainable over the long term. The profound impact of the collective shadow, a genocide, or the toxicity of cancel culture, isn't just because individuals are simply unaware of their potential for aggression. It's often because that capacity is fundamentally unintegrated, it's unowned, and therefore projected onto another.
Teaching individuals to recognize those projections in their daily lives, to consistently question their own motivations and biases, that feels like a practical and perhaps more scalable form of confrontation. It can accumulate to profound personal and even collective transformation over time. It might not be as dramatic as Jung's personal journey, but I don't think it's any less potent in fostering wholeness.
Okay, well, we have certainly delved into the complex and vital concept of Jung's shadow today. We've been debating whether direct, conscious confrontation and integration is the sole necessary path to wholeness, or if other forms of engagement with these unconscious aspects can also lead to profound growth. From my perspective, the material really does seem to strongly emphasize direct engagement with the shadow as the only pathway to genuine wholeness and authentic self-awareness. It's presented as this challenging but absolutely necessary journey of self-reckoning, confronting the raw, uncomfortable truths of our inner darkness, our selfishness, cruelty, capacity for evil, precisely to prevent their unconscious manifestation and to truly break free from that persona prison.
For Jung, and as the text seems to reinforce, true growth, compassion, honesty, they are all contingent on this courageous, unflinching look into the abyss of ourselves, rather than just understanding or managing its effects from, a safe distance.
And I would maintain that while the shadow's pervasive influence is undeniable, and cultivating an acute awareness of it is absolutely crucial for any meaningful growth, the text also allows for, I think, a more nuanced interpretation of integration, one where a singular, direct confrontation isn't necessarily the sole required path for every single person. Jung's own profound, almost destabilizing dissent, as we've discussed, might not be universally applicable or even healthy for all individuals. My perspective is that genuine psychological growth can also emerge from a deep understanding of the shadow's mechanisms, projection, shadow-driven choices, allowing for a more managed, sustained, and perhaps less intensely confrontational form of integration.
This approach, though maybe different in method, can nevertheless lead to conscious self-reflection, a profound shift in one's relationship to their own darker aspects, and ultimately, the ability to choose to act differently, informed by that deep understanding.
What seems abundantly clear from our discussion, though, is that the shadow in all its uncomfortable reality absolutely demands our attention, whether we embrace a path of direct confrontation or navigating its complexities through more nuanced and sustained understanding. Well, the journey toward psychological wholeness seems inextricably linked to how we engage with these darkest parts of ourselves.
Indeed. There is certainly much more to explore here, and how individuals and, frankly, societies navigate this fundamental, often unsettling, but ultimately potentially transformative aspect of the human psyche.